Behind the sunshine harmonies of the Beach Boys was a storm of rage and resentment. For Brian Wilson, the band's troubled genius, no feud cut deeper than his clash with cousin Mike Love. Their battles over creativity, control, and the very soul of the group fueled decades of tension. But why did Wilson come to hate Love more than anyone else in his life? Let's admit it. From the very beginning, Brian Wilson and Mike Love were an uneasy match. Although they were cousins, bandmates, and co-founders of the Beach Boys, their personalities could not have been more different. Brian was the quiet, sensitive musical genius who poured himself into studio experimentation, endlessly chasing new sounds and textures. Mike, on the other hand, was the brash, outspoken frontman who thrived on stage, projecting confidence and charm to audiences worldwide. That difference in temperament, while initially manageable, grew into one of the most infamous feuds in rock history, a battle between art and commerce, vision and pragmatism, silence and noise. The clash first erupted during the creation of Pet Sounds in 1966, a moment that would mark the beginning of one of the most bitter rifts in rock history. Up until that point, the Beach Boys had been synonymous with good times, surfing, hot rods, and sunny California dreams. Their harmonies captured an era, and their success seemed unstoppable. But for Brian Wilson, the band's primary songwriter and producer, the formula was growing stale. He had no interest in repeating surf anthems forever. Instead, he envisioned a daring new direction, one that could elevate pop music into something profound, deeply emotional, and timeless. By 1965, Brian had stopped touring with the group, choosing instead to focus entirely on the studio. He immersed himself in orchestration, layering instruments in ways few in rock had attempted. He was inspired by the Beatles' Rubber Soul, Phil Spector's Wall of Sound, and his own restless creativity. To Brian, Pet Sounds wasn't just another album. It was a mission to prove that the Beach Boys could be more than their reputation suggested. It was, in many ways, his personal statement, one that transcended the band's surf rock origins. Mike Love, however, couldn't have seen things more differently. As the band's frontman, he was acutely aware of what their fans expected: catchy, carefree songs about youth and fun. Brian's new material, lush ballads filled with introspection, spiritual longing, and experimental arrangements, felt foreign to him. He reportedly dismissed the lyrics of Cabin Essence and other songs as nothing more than acid alliteration. To Mike, the music was too arty, too self-indulgent, and too detached from the group's identity. Where Brian saw innovation, Mike saw the destruction of the brand they had built together. The personal stakes only heightened the tension. Brian often treated Pet Sounds as a solo project in everything but name. He hired session musicians from the famed Wrecking Crew rather than relying on his bandmates, layering track upon track in a way that left the others little room to contribute. Mike, who had been the band's voice and energetic face on stage, suddenly found himself marginalized. His role was shrinking, his influence diminishing. He resented the shift, feeling that Brian was not only undermining the Beach Boys' appeal, but also sidelining him personally. To Brian, the criticism cut deeply. He poured his soul into songs like God Only Knows and Caroline, No, only to have his cousin ridicule them. The rejection wasn't just artistic. It was familial, striking at the heart of a bond that should have offered support. Each sneer from Mike confirmed Brian's suspicion that his bold vision wasn't truly appreciated by those closest to him. Instead of encouragement, he encountered resistance and mockery. The fallout from Pet Sounds set the stage for years of animosity. While critics and musicians hailed the album as groundbreaking, Paul McCartney famously called God Only Knows one of the greatest songs ever written, the commercial response in the U.S. was lukewarm compared to the band's earlier hits. For Mike, this confirmed his doubts. Brian's arty detour had damaged their popularity. For Brian, however, it was proof that his cousin couldn't grasp the true purpose of music as an art form rather than just a product. This was the first major fracture that left Brian bitterly opposed to his cousin. What began as a difference in artistic vision evolved into something far more personal. Brian saw Mike not just as a skeptic, but as an obstacle standing in the way of his genius. Mike, in turn, viewed Brian's ambitions as reckless, ego-driven, and out of touch with reality. That collision of ideals, art versus commerce, heart versus formula, would never be fully resolved. The Smile Disaster. Things only got worse during Brian Wilson's attempt to follow up Pet Sounds with what he envisioned as his ultimate statement, the ambitious, otherworldly album known as Smile. If Pet Sounds had strained the bond between Brian and Mike Love, Smile nearly destroyed it completely. For Brian, this wasn't just another record. It was a teenage symphony to God. A sprawling project that would blend classical composition, American mythology, and psychedelic experimentation into something no one in rock had ever attempted. For Mike Love, however, it was the height of indulgence, a bizarre departure that threatened to drag the Beach Boys into irrelevance. Brian teamed with lyricist Van Dyke Parks, a young musician and poet whose surreal stream of consciousness writing captivated him. The lyrics Parks created were dense with imagery, filled with Americana references, cryptic wordplay, and psychedelic flourishes. Songs like Surf's Up and Cabin Essence were intended as dreamscapes, poetic riddles that reflected Brian's boundless imagination. But to Mike Love, they were incomprehensible nonsense. He mocked Parks's lines, scoffing at their ambiguity and famously calling them acid alliteration. To an audience accustomed to cars, surfboards, and California girls, he argued, this was too strange and alienating. The conflict boiled over in the studio. While Brian was meticulously layering sounds, experimenting with animal noises, harpsichords, and modular song structures, Mike often stood on the sidelines, openly dismissing what he heard. In front of session musicians, he criticized the direction of the songs, undercutting Brian's authority and embarrassing him during moments when he was already insecure. To Brian, this wasn't just artistic disagreement. It was sabotage from someone who was supposed to be family. The timing could not have been worse. Brian was already spiraling under the weight of immense pressure. He was experimenting heavily with drugs like LSD and amphetamines, which exacerbated his fragile mental state. Paranoia set in. He began hearing voices, doubting his abilities, and fearing that the project was cursed. Every sneer from Mike, every dismissive comment about the lyrics, reinforced Brian's growing belief that he was losing control, not only of the album, but of himself. Mike, meanwhile, wanted to protect the Beach Boys' commercial viability. To him, the band's strength lay in its simple, accessible pop songs that connected instantly with fans. He argued for returning to the proven formula of surf and sunshine, insisting that Brian's avant-garde direction was alienating their core audience. While this perspective may have had some logic from a business standpoint, Brian saw it as a betrayal. His dream of creating something transcendent was being smothered by a cousin who seemed incapable of understanding art beyond commercial value. The mounting tension eventually caused Smile to collapse. Sessions dragged on without resolution, costs ballooned, and Brian's mental health deteriorated. Van Dyke Parks, exhausted by constant conflict with Mike, walked away from the project. Brian, overwhelmed and increasingly paranoid, finally shelved the album altogether in 1967. To the world, it was a shocking implosion of what many expected to be a masterpiece. To Brian, it was a personal tragedy, one he believed Mike Love had helped engineer. For decades afterward, the ghost of Smile haunted Brian Wilson. Fans and critics alike speculated on what might have been, often pointing to Mike's hostility as the chief reason the project died. While there were many factors, Brian's psychological struggles, the pressures of fame, the heavy drug use, Brian himself often placed much of the blame squarely on Mike. In his mind, Love's rejection of his vision, his mockery of Parks's lyrics, and his relentless push for formula pop had poisoned the atmosphere and killed his dream project. As the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, the Beach Boys were no longer the fresh-faced kings of California surf. The band had weathered the creative storm of Pet Sounds and the disastrous collapse of Smile, but the fallout left scars that would never fully heal. For Brian Wilson, the strain was overwhelming. His mental health was deteriorating rapidly, fueled by paranoia, depression, and heavy drug use. Increasingly unable to function in the studio or on stage, Brian withdrew from the spotlight, retreating into his bedroom for months at a time. Into this vacuum stepped Mike Love. While Brian had once been the creative engine of the band, Mike increasingly became its public face and practical manager. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Mike was the driving force behind the group's touring shows, keeping the band alive financially and ensuring they still had a presence on the road. He pushed for nostalgic set lists filled with early hits, Surfin' USA, Fun, 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 California Girls, songs that instantly transported audiences back to the carefree days of the early 1960s. For Mike, this was good business. The fans wanted familiarity, and the Beach Boys were uniquely positioned to deliver it. But for Brian, watching from the sidelines, this transformation was painful. He resented Mike's growing dominance and felt his cousin had hijacked the band's direction. Where Brian had once dreamed of pushing pop music into new realms of sophistication, the Beach Boys were now, in his eyes, reduced to an oldies act. Their concerts became celebrations of past glories rather than vehicles for innovation. Every setlist heavy on surf anthems and light on newer, riskier material felt like a rejection of his artistry. The clash between vision and pragmatism only deepened the personal divide. Brian's retreat into isolation wasn't just a symptom of his fragile state. It was also a form of silent protest. He could not stomach the band's transformation into a nostalgia machine. He had envisioned the Beach Boys as the American counterpart to the Beatles, capable of changing the face of music with daring experiments. Instead, Mike was steering them toward county fairs and oldies circuits, trading ambition for security. To Brian, this was betrayal. Mike, of course, saw things differently. In his mind, he was saving the Beach Boys. With Brian unable, or unwilling, to lead, someone had to keep the group afloat. He believed audiences craved joy and escapism, not abstract lyrics or avant-garde arrangements. His instincts weren't wrong. The Beach Boys' live shows drew crowds, and their early hits remained beloved. Yet the cost was alienation from Brian, who loathed the commercialism and small-mindedness he saw in Mike's choices. The tension extended beyond music into personal power. Decisions that once would have revolved around Brian's creative authority now fell to Mike, who relished his role as de facto bandleader. This power shift stung. Brian, the man who had built the Beach Boys' reputation as musical innovators, was watching his life's work reshaped into something he didn't recognize. Every time the band was billed as a nostalgia act, every time Mike dismissed the experimental future Brian once envisioned, the resentment deepened. Bitter lawsuits and betrayals. By the 1980s and 1990s, whatever fragile truce had once existed between Brian Wilson and Mike Love shattered completely. Years of resentment over Pet Sounds, the Smile disaster, and the struggle for control had already poisoned their relationship, but the feud reached its ugliest point in the courtroom. What had once been an artistic rivalry within a family became a public spectacle of bitter lawsuits and betrayals, exposing the depth of animosity between the two cousins. Mike Love had long harbored grievances about the credit he received for the Beach Boys' classic hits. While Brian was recognized as the band's creative mastermind, Love believed his own contributions, particularly his lyrics and vocal performances, had been systematically undervalued. By the 1980s, the Beach Boys' catalog had become one of the most lucrative in rock history, generating millions in royalties. Mike grew increasingly vocal in claiming that he had been cheated out of his fair share. The breaking point came when Love sued Brian Wilson in the early 1990s, alleging that Brian and their management had withheld co-writing credits on some of the band's biggest songs, including California Girls, I Get Around, Help Me Rhonda, and Fun, Fun, Fun. To Love, this was about setting the record straight, finally receiving recognition and compensation for what he believed was his rightful role in shaping the Beach Boys' legacy. To Brian, however, the lawsuit was nothing short of treachery. The trial, which dragged on for years, was brutal. Brian, already fragile from decades of mental health struggles, was forced to relive the band's history under the harsh light of legal scrutiny. Love's lawyers painted him as careless with credits, even negligent in how he had documented authorship. For Brian, who saw songwriting as a deeply personal and spiritual act, this reduction of art into legal wrangling was humiliating. Worse still, it was orchestrated by his own cousin, the same man he blamed for mocking Pet Sounds, derailing Smile, and turning the Beach Boys into a nostalgia act. In 1994, the verdict came down in Mike Love's favor. He was awarded $13 million in lost royalties and secured co-writing credit on 35 songs, retroactively rewriting the Beach Boys' history. For Mike, it was vindication, proof that he had been unfairly sidelined in the narrative of the band's success. For Brian, it was the ultimate betrayal. Not only had his cousin dragged him into court and humiliated him publicly, but Love had also forced a legal stamp onto the very songs Brian had always considered his own creations. The bitterness this created was immense. Brian had long resented Mike as the cousin who mocked his genius, undermined his vision, and prioritized commercialism over artistry. Now he also saw him as the man who had taken his music, the purest expression of his soul, and turned it into a legal battleground. For Brian, this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, legacy, and respect. Having to share credit with Mike on songs he had crafted in moments of inspiration felt like a rewriting of history, one that minimized his genius and elevated the very relative he despised. It can be said that while Brian faced abuse from his domineering father Murray, struggled with fractured relationships with his brothers Carl and Dennis, and endured decades of mental illness and exploitation, none of those wounds carried the same sting as his hatred towards Love. The tension between the two men runs deeper than typical family squabbles or band dissents. It was the defining fracture at the heart of the Beach Boys. Unlike others who hurt Brian, Mike Love was impossible to forgive because he represented something far larger. To Brian, Mike wasn't just a difficult relative. He was the living embodiment of everything that blocked his pursuit of artistic freedom, emotional peace, and true happiness. Time and again, when Brian sought to break free into uncharted creative territory, it was Mike who dragged him back to commercial expectations. When Brian longed for understanding, it was Mike who belittled him. When Brian looked for loyalty, it was Mike who instead took him to court. The cumulative weight of those betrayals meant the bitterness never faded. Brian had, in some ways, found closure with his father Murray, whose violent rages and constant belittling had scarred him from childhood. As an older man, Brian spoke less with anger and more with resignation about his father, acknowledging the harm, but no longer letting it consume him. His brothers Carl and Dennis, despite their own tensions, were eventually reconciled with him before their tragic early deaths. Even Brian's internal battles, his paranoia, depression, and drug-fueled breakdowns, were demons he eventually learned to live with through therapy, medication, and the support of his second wife, Melinda. But when it came to Mike Love, there was no truce. The hostility seemed baked into every memory Brian had of him. Love was the cousin who mocked the surreal brilliance of Smile's lyrics, leaving Brian humiliated in front of his collaborators. He was the bandmate who steered the group away from Brian's boundary-pushing music and into safe, nostalgic territory that Brian loathed. He was the relative who seemed to profit endlessly from Brian's work, and then dragged him into court in the 1990s, winning millions in royalties and cementing his name alongside Brian's as a co-writer on classic songs. Even fleeting reconciliations never erased the animosity. In the 2010s, when the surviving Beach Boys briefly reunited for a 50th anniversary tour, there were smiles on stage but bitterness behind the scenes. Brian participated, but when asked later about his contact with the band, he cut through the facade with brutal honesty. Not at all. No, I don't like Mike Love at all. It was a rare, unguarded statement that confirmed what had always been clear. No matter how many decades had passed, the hatred remained. To outsiders, Brian's refusal to soften toward Mike might seem extreme, especially given his ability to forgive others who had arguably caused deeper scars. Yet that's precisely what made his feelings toward Love unique. His father, for all his cruelty, was a broken man of an older generation. His brothers, for all their fights, were still bonded to him through music and blood. His own demons, for all their torment, were a part of himself that he eventually had to accept. But Mike Love? He was the one person who had the choice to support Brian, and instead chose, time and again, to belittle him, oppose him, and profit from his pain. In Brian's mind, Mike wasn't just an antagonist, he was a thief of possibility. The Beach Boys could have been remembered not only for their sunny harmonies and beach anthems, but also for pushing rock music into avant-garde brilliance alongside the Beatles and other innovators. Brian saw that future in Pet Sounds and Smile, only to watch it collapse under pressure, much of which he blamed on Love. Every time Brian thought about what could have been, Mike's face was there as the one who ruined it, and so the hatred endured. Not because of one fight, one lawsuit, or one clash of egos, but because Mike Love came to symbolize every lost dream and every crushed hope that haunted Brian Wilson's life. For Brian, forgiving Mike would mean forgiving the destruction of his greatest ambitions, and that was something he could never bring himself to do. What do you think about this feud? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.